My name is Michael Brown, and I'm an associate professor of history at Rochester Institute of Technology. I'm also a 1998 graduate of Irondequoit High School, and I'm saying that I heard a little applause out there, thank you. I'm saying that for a very specific reason that I think will become clear when I introduce what I would call a blue ribbon plenary panel of Rochester leaders here for us this afternoon. We're going to have a conversation about Rochester and the mid-sized city in the 21st century as a panel, and then we will have a conversation as a room about Rochester and the mid-sized city in the 21st century with all of you and our panelists. So let me introduce you to our panelists. I'll go in alphabetical order by last name, starting with Simeon Bannister. Simeon is the president and CEO of the Rochester Area Community Foundation. And Simeon has given many public talks on redlining and restrictive covenants in the history of Rochester housing. And he puts current calls for addressing racial inequities in the context of these historic injustices. Simeon took the lead in establishing, with a shout out to Frederick Douglass, the North Star Coalition, which helps to ensure that post-pandemic recovery money is used to create opportunities that will benefit residents historically excluded from these opportunities. And Simeon is a graduate of Wilson Magnet High School. Mitch Gruber is an at-large member of Rochester City Council, and Mitch holds a PhD in history from the University of Rochester. So this conference brings together history and the academy and public policy. Let the university, let policymakers, let citizens all talk about the city of Rochester. And Mitch, you embody that with your background and your involvements. Mitch is also the Chief Partnerships and Strategy Officer at FoodLink. We have FoodLink here today with our snacks and meals. It's been delicious. FoodLink is a nonprofit that works to combat food insecurity in Rochester. And that's what Mitch's dissertation put into historical focus. The degradation of the food retail landscape was Mitch's dissertation title. He looked at the development of urban food deserts with a particular focus on Rochester. And Mitch, you're a graduate of Brighton High School. Justin Murphy is a reporter at the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, and he is also the author of Your Children Are Very Greatly in Danger: School Segregation in Rochester, New York. This book was published in 2022, so it's kind of hot off the presses, from Cornell University Press. Justin's book and Justin's journalism focus on education here in Rochester, and Justin, you're a graduate of Penfield High School, if I'm not mistaken. Jackie Ortiz is Monroe County Commissioner of Elections, and prior to her service at the Board of Elections, Jackie was a member of Rochester City Council, first elected as an at-large member in 2009. Jackie led many significant efforts on council, but a particular one might be relevant to this conversation. Jackie led the Tax Lien and Land Bank Task Force of the City Council. Jackie, you're also a graduate like Simeon of Wilson Magnet. Okay. The rest of us are outnumbered here by the Wilson Wildcats. Wilson Wildcats are representing right now.
No one's shocked by that, by the way.
No one is shocked by that. Eversha Roman represents the 26th district in the Monroe County Legislature. Her district includes parts of Rochester, Gates, and Greece. Eversha is the minority leader in the chamber. She is a graduate of the Aquinas Institute and also of Nazareth College, where she studied social work. Eversha has been the assistant director of school-based programs at the Center for Youth, where she worked on programs like Rochester Teen Court. And now Eversha is at the Empire Justice Center, and that's housed in this building, right?
The tax program is, yes.
Okay. Eversha has been named one of the 40 under 40 by the Hispanic Institute of New York State. And why do I bring out under 40, or why do I have this emphasis on high schools and ages? Well, I want to note that these panelists, and someone we'll hear from later this evening, Mayor Malik Evans, represent an incredibly robust generational cohort of Rochester leadership. Mayor Evans, who's part of this generational cohort of leaders, will be in conversation this evening with Mayor William Johnson, who we're honored to have here right now. In many ways, we were the kids of the Johnson era, and we were the children of the Johnson mayoral administration, whether we were in Rochester or in Penfield, Brighton, and Irondequoit. And so it's really interesting to think back not only on the 2002 conversation that Mayor Johnson convened about Rochester and the mid-sized city, but really about our growing up, our lifetimes, our insights and experiences from the point of view of now being leaders in the community. So it is my honor and privilege to be part of this panel and to facilitate it. We're going to use the what we're calling up here the passion hierarchy method of responding to questions. So instead of going up and down the line, I'm going to pose a question as facilitator, and then as the Spirit moves them, I invite panelists to respond in the order that the Spirit acts upon them and their passion motivates them to respond. So the first question is sort of a question of definition, and it's maybe one that's been looming over a lot of our day today. Rochester and the mid-sized city, Rochester as a mid-sized city, what is a mid-sized city? So the first question for the panel, as the Spirit moves any of you, is what sets Rochester and other mid-sized cities apart? What makes a mid-sized city distinctive from big metropolises like New York City on one side of the spectrum, and smaller communities like Batavia or Waterloo, New York on the other side of the spectrum? What do you think are the distinct challenges facing mid-sized cities like Rochester? And what do you think are the distinct opportunities of mid-sized cities like Rochester? And please don't forget to turn on the mic before you respond.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jackie Ortiz, and thank you for the invitation to be here this afternoon. I guess I would start with anytime I've ever described Rochester and this term of being one of the best mid-sized cities in the country, I truly believe that it rings true here as well, is that it's this sense of being large enough where there are a number of cultural activities, a number of universities and high-tech industries, yet at the exact same time, I know I personally feel still small enough where there is this breadth and depth of the ability to really foster great relationships within the community, especially amongst its leaders, elected officials, and those residents all throughout the county and the city of Rochester. So having had the ability of growing up here in this city, going to university not too far away, hour and a half or so, moving away for a few years, coming back home, and having the opportunities that I've had to rise up, if you will, with the support of those around me through the leadership ranks, and have the opportunity to have the privilege of the influence of developing policy, allocation of dollars in this community, I think are extremely great, and especially attributed to the fact that we are a mid-sized city, and someone like myself would have the ability to make those types of strides and make their mark, if you will, within a community like ours. So I will start with that I truly feel that mid-sized city is all of those things encompassed for me.
I can't answer all your questions, Professor Brown. There were like 45 of them. So I'm just going to focus on, I guess, more the feeling of what a mid-sized city is to me, which is, well, I'll share with you the feeling. On Saturday mornings, I go to the public market. It's my favorite place to go in the whole city. It's probably my favorite place to go in the whole world on a regular basis, just because this is where I've spent the vast majority of my life. And what I love about the market is that every Saturday, no matter what time I get there, and it changes significantly now that I have small children that I tow with me, I can be guaranteed to see people that I know and guaranteed to see a ton of things that I don't get to see on a daily basis. I think that it's that kind of combination of the familiarity of places in Rochester, where you show up to the market, you're going to find a friend to sit down and have a cup of coffee with, but you also know you're going to get a chance to talk to vendors, you're going to get to see a family experiencing something new for the first time, you're going to get to see different fruits and vegetables if you're dealing with a 3-year-old like my son. It's that combination of both familiarity and new experiences that I think is what makes Rochester a mid-sized city. I don't think that'd be true, and I think you used the example of Waterloo. I'm sure Waterloo has a great farmer's market. I'm sure everybody who goes there knows each other. And if you go to Union Square Market in New York City, it's probably very rare that you're going to run into someone you know. We just have, I think, the best of both worlds here, which is I'll also answer your question about opportunity. I think Rochester gives anyone an opportunity to leverage the network they have, the experiences they can lean into, while also finding new things to explore, whether it's from a recreational or a professional perspective. Yeah, it's the both and for me. I won't answer your question about challenges because I'll hope to get there later. I'll pass it off now.
I'll say two things. One is that I think from a community leadership perspective, a city the size of Rochester is, I mean, every single thing that any of us say will be, yes, that's good, but also that's bad, is able to be greatly affected and or hijacked by a single charismatic person. And of course, every city's got charismatic people, but George Eastman couldn't have been George Eastman in Kodak has veto power when everybody says something about George Eastman. I think Joseph Wilson had an effect like that. I think George Aldridge had an effect like that at the end of the 19th century. I think Maury Silver had an effect like that, in that they were not only able to affect change, which of course you could do in a smaller community, but also like bring a significant community base along with them. And then the other thing, and so some of us were on WXXI talking about this topic last week, and one of the things from that stuck with me is the idea about how we talk about ourselves. And I think a thing about a mid-sized city is that it's very hard to tell more than one story at a time. So in Painted Post, maybe it's easy to tell one story because everybody knows each other. And in New York, it's understood that you can't tell one story because there's a million people there. But I think that sometimes in Rochester, we feel like we have one story, but we don't. And we project that to other people as well. So we feel like, oh, we all love Wegmans, but actually people feel differently about Wegmans if they live in a place that Wegmans left. We all love and know Kodak, but actually there's a lot of people that didn't have that opportunity to build up through their family at Kodak in the same way. So those are two things that come to mind for me.
So it's really a pleasure to be here with this, as you call it, Michael, Blue Ribbon panel. I'll also point out that Michael's already proven to be such a capable moderator for this conversation, though he did forget to mention that Mayor Malik Evans also is a Wilson graduate. I really appreciated the framing for this conversation. I hadn't really thought about it this way because my own unique experience was very much being a child of the Johnson administration. But it's true that in some sense all of us were kind of coming of age during that period. What makes Rochester such a unique and interesting place to me, particularly in reference to that period, is that I remember being a kid that could walk into my mayor's office. I remember being a kid that could come home from college and could visit with my mayor. And if we were in New York City or Chicago or some other place that really wasn't a real possibility. That wasn't something that could happen. At the same time, we were also still a place that was large enough that as I've come of age, the relevance of our community still kind of rings out in a lot of ways across the country. What's fascinating, I do think that there's some uniqueness, though, about Rochester's story that actually is a little bit distinguishing from some other places. Rochester is the 110th, 111th city by population in the country. Our MSA is the 52nd largest MSA in the country. We're the 111th largest city, but your community foundation is the 51st largest community foundation in the country. So there's some interesting distinctions about being a place that is relatively small, but in a lot of ways has punched over its weight. The other thing I find is fascinating about our story is that the kind of narrative arc of Rochester, this community that was the young lion of the West, hard to imagine Rochester being considered the West, right? But this community that was the young lion of the West that really grew very quickly, really kind of sat at the zenith of American economic prominence, particularly in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, is also the place that we all inhabit today that doesn't feel like that. And I wonder how we've wrestled, or not, with that reality. And what that means for how we change those dynamics. I appreciated Justin's framing that begs some really important questions about how that narrative either includes or doesn't include. And part of the reason I wonder if we've been disabled from being able to make that kind of progress is because our narratives haven't been inclusive and broad enough.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So as someone who enjoys traveling, when I saw this question, the first thing I thought about in reference to what makes Rochester a mid-sized city is, the reality of being at places and experiencing places like New Delhi in India, where you really feel like a speck in the middle of organized chaos, where you can see the population through how dense the air is. You can literally see, how many people are in the community because of the haziness of the pollution and other things. But it's literally in the air. I know it's in our air too, but you can physically see it as soon as you step off of a plane. In the stark comparison of currently going on a adventure, if you will, with my fiance to rehab a home in Hammondsport, New York. This is the bottom of Keuka Lake, if you've ever been there. A beautiful place, super exciting, very welcoming. But the reality of that is we walk into the local bar and the bartender is like, "Where are you guys from?" So everyone clearly knows, the 200, 300 people that are part of that community. So for me, Rochester is right in the middle of that. The reality is, right, most places you will be able to bump into someone feel at home, be comfortable. But then the reality is that for me, Rochester is large enough that I can walk into a room like this and probably only know 2 or 3 people. But it has granted opportunities, as was mentioned, because there is enough connectedness. Therefore, sometimes there are opportunities presented. It's really interesting to hear all of our high school dynamics that came into play. Had no idea, right? I think you brought up Kodak and its influence. Had no idea Wilson had that kind of influence on our community. But even if you think about our former mayor, there are institutions, there are individuals who have created immense impact in our small community. Wegmans was mentioned as one of them. I think that is what mid-sized cities are. They're influenced easier than a bigger dwelling or city.
Thank you.
Good and bad.
So there's a theme emerging here of a kind of set of double-edged swords that seems to be characteristic of mid-sized cities. That the ability of a small group of people to have efficacy can cut both ways. It can produce change and empowerment. It can blockade change and empowerment. I also want to talk about this theme of the stories we tell about the mid-sized city, the narratives. let me read you something from a website. Mid-sized cities in America offer great alternatives in terms of both travel and settling down. With many of the benefits and fewer downsides than their larger counterparts, mid-sized localities are attracting young people hungry for opportunity. This website gives a list of 19 mid-sized U.S. cities that, quote, offer great overall quality of life and appeal to hip and diverse populations. Number 2 on that list, from 2021, Rochester, New York. Another list from 2018, compiled by ACT Rochester, is of the poorest cities in the United States as measured by poverty rate. And in 2018, Rochester was number 3 on that list. So, hippest and poorest. Mid-sized cities are sometimes depicted in a story that characterizes them as places in decline, places that have lost population, places that have lost industries, places that have lost their visibility, their stature, their pride on the national stage. But then mid-sized cities are also described as innovative, affordable, livable cities on the upswing. We can point to mid-sized examples, and these are such good examples that maybe they're no longer mid-sized. Places like Austin. I think we talk about Buffalo in a different way in this decade than we did in the previous decade. Pittsburgh is spoken of much differently today than it was in the 80s or 90s. And then we talk about that decline narrative about mid-sized cities too, whether it be Akron, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Duluth, Minnesota. And Rochester seems to have both of these stories told about it. This innovative, livable city on the upswing, this mid-sized city in decline. Which of these stories about Rochester and mid-sized cities rings true to you? And which of these stories do you think we most urgently need to tell? And maybe you could make a case for either of them. And I noticed we used the linear method before, but feel free to return to the passion hierarchy if you would like.
Making sure, okay. Thank you again, Michael. You know, it's so interesting, and because again, every single time we've kind of gone through this, we've all essentially said very similar things, and the exact description of what you just read there, I think, was embodied in many of the things that we talked about. And I really think those two things, it depends on who you ask, right? And so for me, it's certainly both of those things. For an individual who has grown up in this community in 14605, probably one of the most economically depressed zip codes in this county, and you know, seeing your family, your friends, your neighbors struggling economically when it comes to both prosperity, economic prosperity, as well as education, yet at the same time had a support network because of the size of this city and many of the opportunities that are presented to us in a variety of ways, had the ability to move forward, right? Attain higher education, have the ability to acquire different professional and career opportunities, and also now have the ability to see the other side of Rochester as this up-and-coming city on the upswing with all of these wonderful cultural events and housing opportunities, you know, all the new things that are being built and all of that, but at the same time still having friends and family that are still sitting on that other side, that you're trying to do your best, and why I'm trying to take the steps that I have to become involved within leadership in this particular community to ensure that those voices and those needs that are still out there in our community are being heard and are you know, that we take all of those things into consideration, because on the ground level, you know, you can't have all of these wonderful upswing things when majority of your community is still suffering. And there are so many things that we can continue to do and that we have to do and think outside of the box to be able to we bring everyone along with us. And we have to really come back to and taking a look at that from the ground level. What does our educational system look like? What do those mid-level economic employment opportunities look like, right? The days of the Kodaks and Xeroxes and things like that, where a high school degree was enough for many individuals to be able to sustain themselves and their families and really create something for themselves. But much of that has changed, and so I certainly see both sides. I'm working in different capacities to make sure that, again, those voices are heard and that we're trying to provide not only the cultural activities and the wonderful housing for the upswing, but at the same time, making sure that we're not forgetting those who are not necessarily able to capture that part of the upswing here. So I'll leave it at that, but I certainly see both sides of it and working hard to make sure that no one is left behind.
I can go. That's fine. So it's a both and, right? And I think it's necessary for the flourishing parts of our community to continue to be highlighted and supported and reinforced, right, in our storytelling. But it's absolutely necessary to continue to talk about the reality of how very segregated our community still continues to be, where you can drive within 7 minutes of each other and see stark realities of what our mid-sized city looks like. Just the statistic that is this bad? The statistic, am I just talking too loud? That can happen. Not me? Hello? Okay. Thank you. Where you can drive 7 minutes in either direction and be in completely different social economic status, zip codes, educational differences for the most part, but not truly see that both communities are working communities, right? Working just unfortunately in different realities. I think, there's some data that's coming out that talks to the reality of 14605, 14621 being working poor. They're working just as hard, sometimes harder than other individuals within our community, but the opportunities are just different, right? They're clocking in differently and working at wages that are far less than others for a plethora of reasons that I'm sure others will get into. Life expectancies are different depending on what zip code you've grown up in. And I think those stories need to be told. I often think about myself. So, I grew up in 14605. It's one of the zip codes that's on the hot list for many things. I grew up during a generation of which Latinas in 14605, 14621 had a higher pregnancy rate than other women in our community. So those statistics have always and continue to follow, my generation. And I think it's really important that we still have those conversations because if enough effort, in my opinion, were to be put into continuing to uplift our communities, we are small enough to see that change. So that's me.
So I really want to play with this idea, this kind of offering that Justin gave us about the narrowness of how narrative is constructed in our community, because it really is fascinating. During the pandemic, when things really started to get rolling and we transitioned to virtual, I had this experience where, pre-pandemic, I found myself zipping and zapping to this meeting and that, and this conversation and that. And in the pandemic, in the midst of the worst of it, having transitioned to Zoom, all of a sudden we were doing these back-to-back. And had this experience of leaving a meeting and having someone say, all right, I've got to go early, I've got another meeting to get to. Transitioning over and being like, wait, it's the same people that are in this meeting, and then doing that over and over and over again, day after day after day after day. And so essentially what you get is an echo chamber of folks that are reinforcing, some narratives about our community. And so it's interesting to think about how we explode some of those echo chambers. We actually, Rochester won the All-American Cities Award which identifies great American cities. We won it in 2019. Most people don't know that because by the time we got into 2020, why would you have? You wouldn't have heard about it. The reason why we won, Doug Linkart from All American Cities came and visited with us a couple of years ago after the award and said that we actually had one of the highest scoring applications that year. And what he appreciated about our application is that when we started the process of building this, it started off about all the great things that Rochester is and all the great, that's what these awards often do. And we paused them for a moment and said, you know what, this is not the shared reality of a whole lot of folks that are living in this community. And it's certainly not the historical reality of a lot of folks that have shared this community. And so we changed the narrative construct to talk about the decline that was, I would argue, largely driven by homogenous, top-down decision-making, hierarchical decision-making that was often extractive and short-sighted. And the way that this community is starting to bend the curve to start to think more about democratically oriented processes, more civic robustness, more civic governance, and different approaches. But narrative is a choice. Narrative is a choice. What we choose to talk about ourselves, what we choose to say about ourselves, how we choose to understand ourselves, and that narrative then shapes the horizons for what we see as possible. And I think that where I want to live, and with this cadre of new leaders, is how we shift the narrative here in Rochester, how we choose a different narrative that looks like, again, democratic, that looks like more opportunities for folks to be engaged, and how that becomes our reality.
I agree with Simeon, and I think that part of what that looks like is not picking between those narratives, but at the least holding them both in your mind at the same time, and that's very difficult in every setting. That that's something that certainly I deal with as a daily journalist, is picking and choosing which stories we tell and how we tell them. To sort of jump to some parallel tracks, that's the same difficulty as the difficulty around white supremacy and white privilege, is that it's very hard for people like, for instance, Mitch and I to think, on one hand, our parents and grandparents worked very hard and did great things and put us in a position to succeed and got help from the government in doing that, and that's all good and just. And also it was deeply unjust that didn't happen for everybody, and somewhere down the line our ancestors may have had something to do with that. And that's not something to resolve, that's just two things that you need to hold and get some kinetic energy out of. And the other thing I would say about that is that difficulty of holding those two narratives together in your mind at the same time is reflected and replicated by our physical structures of segregation. It's always hard to have those, to think about those things and talk about those things. It's much harder to do it if people having different experiences are living 20 miles apart. And we can, it's very nice and cute that you can drive everywhere in 15 minutes, but in fact, people don't drive between those two worlds in 15 minutes a lot of the time.
Both things are certainly true. We are, I shouldn't say certainly, but people think we're hip. I don't know really what hip means. But we are hip to some people, and we're objectively poor. Both things are true, and I think that's what everyone has said thus far, is that we need to figure out how to recognize that both those things are true at the same time. And I think to Jackie's point is, how do we always make sure that we're trying to move towards a place where everybody gets to see the most possible benefit from living in Rochester. I won't repeat what other people said. For the most part, I want to take it in a slightly different direction. Simeon stated that narrative is a choice, and I'm curious about the cities that Michael read off in his list. I mean, I don't know how someone from Pittsburgh feels about Pittsburgh right now, but certainly from the outside, we talk about Pittsburgh as like, oh, it kind of made it over the hill. Like Pittsburgh has made it. Pittsburgh's in a much better place than a lot of other Rust Belt cities. I don't know if that's the narrative that Yinzers, I think that's the word they use, that Yinzers would use. But I do think that there's things that we can all think through collectively here around like what does separate the city that's on the incline from a city on the decline. And one of those things is around the way that we get real constructive buy-in from our anchor institutions. And the way that we have real consistent public-private nonprofit partnerships. And I think that one of the reasons why Rochester seems to be looking up the hill and maybe Pittsburgh is looking down the hill is that, you know, you look at the lead anchor at in downtown Pittsburgh, it's UPMC. I don't see the University of Rochester or RIT anywhere in downtown Rochester. You look at the Fortune 500 companies that are in Pittsburgh. My understanding is that Pittsburgh has places like Google and I don't know, other tech companies that I couldn't name, but they exist in downtown Pittsburgh, and they peel off of the pretty significant student body in the city of Pittsburgh. We have 3 Fortune 500 companies in Rochester. Not one of them has a footprint downtown. That's changing. Hopefully, we have Constellation Brands hopefully making a change pretty soon. But it is hard to think about how we move on the incline as a city when the most significant nonprofit institutions, colleges, universities, hospitals, the most significant private institutions, the businesses that are just churning out money and jobs, are not investing in our city. And I think that gets back to what Simeon said about the difference between the size of the city and the MSA. We also don't have collaboration between government. We have 19 school districts in this county. That's insane. The library happens to be one of the few places that is incredibly high functioning because it's one of the few institutions that actually has true intermunicipal support and countywide collaboration. So I think that we are maybe like right in the space that a lot of other cities that are mid-sized has been, and we see the both and we see that both lists that Michael read are true. How do we figure out how to get to the next phase? How do we get to where I think Pittsburgh is? We need to figure out how to get all these institutions working together towards the same goal.
I forgot I have a mic on my face. That's how good it is. I want to say that, Mitch, if you don't spend time worrying about the definition of hip, that means you're hip.
Tell that to my wardrobe.
There's a lot of importance here, and I want to come back to a number of things. Let's talk about echo chambers and anchor institutions in Rochester and the mid-sized city. Justin, you gave the example of George Eastman's outsized role in the history of Rochester, Joseph Wilson's outsized role in Rochester history. When we look at history or to the present moment and even the future, is it a strength of the mid-sized city that it's of the scale where one person or one institution or one small group of people or one cluster of anchor institutions can make a very significant impact? Or is that a weakness? Part of Rochester's history is the nickname Smugtown, suggesting that a small group of institutions and people have run things. But we're also telling a story now about Rochester as a radical town with the radicalism of Frederick Douglass or Franklin Florence. We have a radical tradition. So are we looking for the next small group of institutions and people, be it Paychex, Paytech, or Photonics, to replace our old groups of institutions and people and maybe do better? Or is the mid-sized city ripe for a more broad-based social movement, grassroots model of change? And is the mid-sized city conducive to a grassroots, broad-based, more social movement model of change? Or is the mid-sized city kind of a conservative place where that model of change doesn't get as much traction as it would in a larger metropolis? And passion, hierarchy, or list, your choice.
I got some passion. I'm inclined to think that it's a negative thing. I think, first of all, the selection process for who gets to be a charismatic leader is inevitably flawed. I don't know who I would choose if I could. It wouldn't be me. And I think, so I just got finished reading Death and Life of the Great American Cities, the famous Jane Jacobs book, and she rhapsodizes about the value of just a million people milling about and each doing their own thing, and it's all those interactions and accretions and whatnot that make the city what it is. And I suspect that you could say there's something similar in a small place where you don't have those numbers, but it's small enough that you know all the people, and so you all have to take each other's stuff into account. I think that we don't really have either of those necessarily in Rochester, and so it becomes appealing that if you can pull together enough power, you can make some change. And like Frederick Douglass is an interesting example because he put Rochester on the map in a lot of ways, and of course did incredible things, and also left because somebody burned his house down. And at this stage, looking back, it's hard to say where he was able, as probably the most charismatic and interesting person of the 19th century, like how he positioned us ahead of other cities our size. So I'm not inclined to subscribe to that model of change.
I would agree with Justin, and I think we have to be very careful I would say, not entrust per se all of the important work that needs to happen with just a few anchor institutions, if you will, or certainly they are part of the solution, but I think we have to be very careful when we dub certain individuals and or anchor institutions, if you will, as somehow the solution to something of what we're dealing with and the challenges that we have. Because when you start to go down that road, which I think we've unfortunately done many times, there is this sense and this mentality of, well, okay, they're taking care of it. These individuals will kind of figure things out, where there are, a swath of individuals who have something to contribute. If brought into the conversation and allowed the opportunity to be part of that solution and engage in a meaningful way, would actually assist and be more engaged if provided the right opportunities. And so I think we have to be careful not to put too much weight into, well, these particular individuals or institutions here, have at it, and then do for everyone else. When we all know that the collective is really what uplifts us all when we're all participating and feeling engaged. The other thing, I think that what stops us here, and it probably isn't necessarily just, it's not a Rochester issue, if you will, is this ability for all of us to actually talk to each other, right? I think that when we talked about, this, it's a 5-minute drive or 7-minute, whatever it is, but we're not doing it, and if you're doing it, you're driving past or around it, not necessarily to each other per se. There is no real collaboration amongst the variety of communities that we have, right? Some of us have the ability to span a variety of different communities just based on where we grew up or where we are now, where we go to school, where we work, so on and so forth. So some of us have that opportunity, but so many of us don't. And quite frankly, I think so many of us are afraid. And I think that we have to provide more opportunities for people to actually get to know each other, right? Understand the experiences that other people are having, why certain things are the way they are, why certain behaviors and certain actions are occurring with individuals. We see something on the news and then we automatically rush to judgment that, it's the parents, it's this, it's that, why, all of these types of things, when if we actually understood someone's situation and had the opportunity to have more conversations in a meaningful way and engage, like we're here at this particular event and there are a number of other things that are happening, but how many times do these types of things or other things that are happening in the community actually span a variety of individuals from those economic statuses, educational levels, all of those things? I would probably venture to say very rarely. And so we actually have to be a little bit more outside of the box and thinking of how do we engage. I'll just throw one example out, right? I really do think underpinnings of this community and some of the things we need to talk about is our educational system. And You know, it's one of those things when you talked about 19 school districts, I think that's absolutely insane. And there have been talks about countywide school systems, and all of a sudden everybody shudders and they're absolutely just afraid of it. It'll never happen here. And I'm not saying that's the solution, but the fact that everyone is so afraid to even have the conversation is quite frightening. And so that's something we need to talk about. Perhaps we partner one suburban school with a city school to do activities together, to create pen pals together. Whatever the situation might be, I think we got to go back to the basics, and we got to start understanding that who we are as human beings, our lived experiences, and how we share with one another to actually be able to build and lift each other up. I'm not going to want to support and help you if I can't understand who you are and where you come from.
I just want to highlight one person who was not scared to have that conversation is Mayor Bill Johnson. I'm looking forward to hearing from him in a little bit. So. I don't want to, I'm sitting between two people who just said that the anchor institution line that I said before is maybe not right. I don't want to disagree with them. I agree anchor institutions are not the savior of the city, and there's no doubt that there is power and influence in any individual, any group of people. There's no doubt about that. However, I am going to defend my statement for a second here by just talking about a couple of facts, which is that the city of Rochester, we're not the federal government. We don't get to print money. We have to pass a balanced budget every year. And our budget is really, really, really artificially depressed by the fact that we don't have any real financial support from our anchor institutions, including not just the fact that a place like the University of Rochester owns $500 million worth of property and pays $0 in property tax, but even that places like Paychex employ a ton of young people and convince them to live close to Webster, where their headquarters is. That makes a significant difference, and we can only go as far as a community, as a city, I should say, as our budget allows us to spend. And we're capped right now. And I just want to point out a couple budget things for folks in the audience who may not already know this. The city of Rochester's budget last year, with ARPA being the biggest budget we ever passed, was about $625 million. The Rochester City School District's budget was $1.2 billion. The city of Rochester's budget, Eversha, tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's about the size of Monroe County Department of Human Services. One department in an entire county. We are consistently looked at to be the organization, and this is, as the city council member here and the finance chair of the city council, we're looked at to provide answers, and sometimes if you simply don't have the money to provide answers, it's really hard to do it. And one of the few ways that we can actually grow our tax base here and grow our ability to do good things for this community is by getting our anchor institutions to be part of the solution.
So I kind of want to return to this question of,
We'll have a question and answer session with the audience in
Yeah.
a little bit. So
very much looking forward
save
to
your
the,
questions to your mental hard drive, and we'll come back to them
I
in a
feel like there's some
moment.
passion out there. There's a hierarchy.
You're using the passion hierarchy, aren't you? Right?
So I do want to return back to this question of kind of which approach kind of makes sense, whether it's a more kind of concentrated approach or whether it's a more kind of distributed approach. Michael actually put me onto something a few years back that turned into like a whole presentation. He made a distinction for me coming out of the philosophy of history between history and myth, right? So history including things like I got up this morning, I put on a pair of pants, I put on some shoes and socks, and none of you care about that, right? No one's going to put that in a textbook. No one's going to remember it. Historicity, on the other hand, helps us to appreciate things that are anchored to things that actually did happen, real history, but that are important enough for us to remember and for us to carry forward, for us to transmit from one generation to another generation. One of the things I find that's a bit of a challenge in our community is that I find that we tend to be a bit ahistorical, that we tend to forget history. We talk about innovation, we talk about distributed decision making. In this community, in Rochester in the late 90s and early 2000s in Mayor Johnson's administration, we innovated in this community to create something called Neighbors Building Neighborhoods. Neighbors Building Neighborhoods had sectors, 10 sectors across the city that were hubs for folks to come together and engage with the city planning department, ultimately to drive the decision-making for this city. And it burgeoned out of a realization by folks like Tom Argist at the time and Larry Stith at the time, who had realized that one of the challenges of our budget process was that it didn't have any buy-in from citizens, and so the budgets kept being defeated or haven't running into challenges towards the end of the Ryan administration. And so this new model was tried here in Rochester. And not only was it tried, but it actually ran several years in a row, and each time it would get tinkered with and changed. That's called innovation. That's the process of improvement. And then when we transitioned from one administration to the next, unfortunately, it ended and it died. And I wrestle with what it would have looked like to keep something like Neighbors Building Neighborhoods alive, especially because I enter into a lot of conversations today where people are like, you know what we could really use in Rochester? Some kind of like neighborhood hub where people could get information, you know? I was like, oh, you mean like a net office, right? Like a neighborhood empowerment office. By the way, what's in the power of a word? Going from neighborhood empowerment offices to neighbor service centers, right? Two very distinct ways of thinking about what people need. There are people in this room right now that were part of that movement of Neighbors Building Neighborhoods. And so it seems to me that that's part of our tradition that we can recover and we can revitalize, because you got to have alternatives, right? We can't just say we don't like that over-concentrated decision-making, but oh well, right? A reasonable alternative to me is to try to resurrect some of that kind of infrastructure, but modernize it. I'll say one last thing about it. Neighbors Building Neighborhoods, from what I've read and come across and conversations I've had a system that was called NeighborLink, right? NeighborLink was a computer-oriented system where people could share data, information, insights. It had a chat feature, right? I have more computing power in my phone right now than I'm sure every computer that was part of NeighborLink had at the time, right? So because of the advances that we've made, in some ways it was an idea before its time. So instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, let's try again, right?
So I'm just sitting here and thinking, and I'm not sure if I have much more to add, but I'll try. So it's interesting just thinking about, you know, the way in which individuals have been able to lead in our community, and I can just say that, or institutions, right? I could say that access to being provided with the opportunity to lead just hasn't been equitable. Therefore, many voices haven't been at the decision-making tables to even say, right, there's this amazing piece of land in downtown Rochester. Have you ever seen it before? And the answer could be, or most likely would be, no. Because as mentioned, you can drive 15 minutes in either direction and be in a completely different reality, but we don't do that as a community too often. It's still startling for me, and I think I'll just say this, that just a little bit of history about myself. I'm the first Latina elected to Monroe County Legislature, which is, thank you, which is both amazing and scary that we had a governing body for 100 years in Monroe County that never had a woman of Latina descent at the table. And that's a reality still. We're still celebrating a lot of firsts in the private sector, in the public sector, right? You think about individuals leading organizations that are making these decisions in our community. And for me, one of the things that I often share is that I truly believe that your perspective is and becomes your priority. And that has absolutely, it's not, no shade, you know, it's not anything to say that it's negative, but literally the way in which your life has been is your reality, and that's what you're going to bring to the table. So,
Thank you so much, panelists. I have 2 questions and then conversation with the room. I want to pull on a strand that I heard many of you speak about and ask you whether mid-sized cities are Goliaths or Gullivers. I bought my dad this print from Parkley Pharmacy. It's Art Deco. It's the Times Square building with the wings of progress. And the skyline of Rochester, in some kind of Gotham-like way, is depicted as at the center, the heart, the towering city at the center of its region. But a feature of mid-sized cities since mid-century has been that they are often ringed by maximum-sized suburbs. And now Goliath starts to look more like Gulliver, a giant who can't move because all these strings, little strings, layers and layers of impediments are preventing that movement. However strongly Gulliver might try to move. When we think of anchor institutions, an anchor can always be pulled up and the ship can sail away. So are mid-sized cities captives of these institutions, especially corporations that can relocate or leave if the pilot program or the tax abatements expire? Or are mid-sized cities captains of their own destiny? To what extent is a mid-sized city the regional Goliath, the regional captain, or the regional captive, the regional Gulliver? I'm detecting a Professor Brown.
Round of applause for a heck of a question. That is good stuff.
Again, I think it's certainly multi-pronged approach to all of this, and I do think and agree with Councilmember Gruber that the investment that needs to be made from the anchor institutions that serve this community are extremely important, and I think that they do provide that base that is so absolutely necessary for the community to be able to have many of the resources that it needs to be able to potentially fund other opportunities, right? And so I think while that is occurring, it needs to occur, we also have to be innovative and supportive and nurturing of incubator type opportunities so that the next Wegman, the next Xerox, the next Bausch and Lomb, or whatever it may be, has the opportunity to be nurtured to a level at which it expands to then become the next opportunity for hundreds of people in our community, right? So we have to be able to allow this to occur, ensure that it's occurring, but at the same time be forward thinking and supportive in whether it be, additional grant programming or a new utilization of empty spaces that we have, right? We actually, we have a ton of empty buildings, and what can we do with those, right? Obviously, perhaps there's different programs in terms of allowing free spaces, if you will, right? I mean, if they're not collecting any money at the moment, then we might as well potentially foster new opportunities in some of those spaces for people to be able to grow and foster their ideas. There's different and interesting land use opportunities. There's new and different opportunities for housing. And as much as we're building housing and as much as beautiful as it is, there are so many different types of housing and opportunities out there that I don't necessarily think we're taking advantage of, right? There is opportunity that was researched many years ago that I wish would take off here, and something where you have intergenerational opportunities to be able to support one another, and that would be co-housing, right? And we have aging populations that want to stay in place. You have younger people who need the support. That would be an amazing opportunity for us to take a look at some of those types of things to be able to support our communities. I'm a tiny house fan in that particular opportunity, right? Sometimes if we want to also increase home ownership opportunities, which we all know are many times how many people build the wealth for their families, and being able to build that equity that they have to be able to utilize for other things. And we need to be able to think about how are we able to provide those type of opportunities in an affordable way and a maintainable affordable way, right? Because it's not just about being able to pay the mortgage, it's also being able to maintain these houses. Many people would say, oh, well, you can buy a house in the city of Rochester for $50,000, and that's okay, wonderful. But can you maintain and put the roof back on that house in the next 5 years? Can you make sure that the siding gets taken care of, the furnace, and so on and so forth? We have to be able to look at new innovative ideas, not only that will provide opportunities, but also would be business opportunities as well for our residents to be able to support themselves and again, be able to employ others. So multi-pronged approach here to be able to really uplift our community.
I wish I had been asked to study the stories of Goliath and Gulliver prior to this, because I'd like to be able to give like a really sophisticated answer. They're just not stories I know that well. Pardon me. I'll just answer the question by saying that I think we're in I like to think of Rochester as being in a position of strength. My day job is at FoodLink. We serve 10 counties. And I spend a lot of time in very rural parts of our service areas. So the rural parts of not just the Finger Lakes, but also going west. I was in Pavilion just last week. Pavilion's on the kind of border of Genesee and Wyoming counties. And it's hard to say these words even, but like I just don't understand what the path forward is for really small rural communities like Pavilion. I don't see what the path forward is for a lot of communities that in across New York State, small communities who actually have prisons as their primary source of employment. It's really hard to, and by the way, those prisons are now, for good reason, beginning to close. It's really hard to imagine what happens in very, very, very small towns in at least rural upstate New York. And then I look downstate and I look at New York City and I try to imagine what it must be like to be a city council member in New York City, and I don't know how government actually moves. And I actually haven't, in my lifetime as an adult, I haven't remembered there being a mayor or a city council member in New York that like was widely regarded as doing a great job, because it's probably a very impossible job to do. We have some, I think, very concrete things that we need to do in Rochester. As I said before, one of my big concerns is I don't think that we have the funding and the dollars to be able to do all of them, but there are dollars to be found. I think what makes me feel like we're in a position of strength is that it's clear the things we have to do. Jackie touched on housing. We clearly have to figure out how to strengthen a very old housing stock and also how to right-size our city and build more in vacant lands. And as Professor Newman talked about prior to, dealing with the fact that almost every single vacant land in the city of Rochester is inevitably a brownfield or inevitably has environmental issues, which only just makes the building of those properties significantly more expensive. But we know what we have to do, at least. That's nice. We know we have to activate our river. We know we have to activate our waterways. We know we have to build more walkable and bikeable city. There are really concrete things that we know we have to do, and there's a path forward. And so for that, I think we're in a position of strength. And I'll end this comment by saying a lot of that stuff is actually written into a really good comprehensive plan called ROC 2034, which is available on the city's website and something for anyone to go look at. It was the update to the comprehensive plan that Mayor Johnson's administration did back in, 2001? The Renaissance Plan? Okay, I think 2001. There's a lot of linear arguments from one to the other, and there's clear things that we have on paper and writing that we have to work on, and that feels like we're in a position of strength. So is that Goliath?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'm going to pick Gulliver. Among the Lilliputians, I'm going to go out on a limb and say the Brobdingnons. Are those the giants?
Yeah. Sounds right.
Thank you.
And thank you for going with it.
You're welcome. I am as a journalist, I'm kind of a pessimist by nature, but I'm a pessimist about cities the size of Rochester, or maybe almost any size, being able to chart a drastically different course for themselves. Not only because of the internal dynamics that we've been talking about, but because it's surrounded by like mouse traps of veto power on things. As an example, I think that most people in education would agree that kids take more tests than are good for them. Kids in RCSD and everywhere are taking tests this week. They're for like hours a day. And I think that the Rochester School Board and other school boards would say if we had our way, we would get rid of those. But you can't. You just absolutely can't. And it doesn't matter if you have a school board with Jesus, Mary, Joseph, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You can't get rid of the tests. I think that we meaning Rochesterians, but we probably meaning people everywhere, like to ascribe a lot more local agency to ourselves than is warranted. I remember when Richard Rothstein came through talking about the color of law, some of us reporters talked to him ahead of time, and we asked him, well, what about Rochester? Like, what do you see here? What's, like, obviously that's the first question, and, like, how do you explain all these terrible outcomes we have? And he said, I always remember, he said, I go all across the country giving this presentation about this book, and every single place I go, the first thing anybody tries to do is persuade me that their city is the worst. Actually, our city is the worst. And he says, no, like, you've all have your terrible things and your special little projects that you did wrong, but this isn't about Rochester. That's true of housing discrimination, that's true of urban renewal. Like, there were individual, villains that made villainous decisions in Rochester around urban renewal. And also, even if there weren't, we still would have gotten urban renewed. That was just what was happening at the time. So, I'm on Team Gulliver.
So I tend to think Goliath, but not for the reasons why you might think. If you remember the rest of the Goliath story, Goliath got felled because of his arrogance and his complacency. That's why he got his block knocked off. If I can just share a quick quote with you. This is from The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. She's quoting Catherine Phillips from the Columbia Business School, who's the first African-American woman to get tenure there, saying, members of a homogenous group rest somewhat assured that they will agree with one another, that they will understand one another's perspectives and beliefs, that they will be able to easily come to a consensus. But when members of a group notice that they are socially different from one another, they change their expectations. They anticipate differences of opinion and perspective. They assume they will need to work harder to come to a consensus. This logic helps to explain both the upside and the downside of social diversity. People work harder in diverse environments, both cognitively and socially. They might not like it, but the hard work often leads to better outcomes. I've talked with Jean Dupre, folks like Bob Rosenfeld, my predecessor, Jennifer Leonard. Her executive assistant, Norma Galloway, was a C-suite executive at Kodak during its prime years. And what all of them have described for me inside Kodak is a culture that had become complacent, a culture that was homogenous, a culture that was self-reinforcing, a culture that missed the digital revolution. So it strikes me that part of the challenge of our history is that maybe we got a little too arrogant, a little too complacent, and we missed really important moments that with a different arrangement would have led us to real opportunities. I think Justin's absolutely right that there are a lot of exogenous factors that hit this community, right? Urban renewal is an example of that. Part of what drove urban renewal was the set-asides for significant dollars from the federal government that a lot of municipalities said, well, heck, if the only way I can get it is to drive these roadways through neighborhoods, then here we go, let's do it. And so the challenge for us, I think now, is how comfortable are we still walking into the same rooms where we don't see any diversity? How comfortable are we still walking into the same rooms where the voices are a little too homogenous. I want to encourage all of us not to question it just as a moral imperative, but really as a practical question. We can't make good decisions if everybody in the room looks the same. That's something that we're wrestling with. That's something that we're wrestling with certainly in our nonprofit community. If you're servicing communities that are diverse and you have no diversity in your leadership, no diversity on your board, how can we expect that those are going to be organizations that are going to be effective in the work that needs to be done? So there's a real opportunity for transformation here, I think, as a community. But that transformation doesn't happen just because, you know, somebody deemed me king of Rochester, right? That did not happen. It happens because all of us come together and we decide collectively that that's the kind of outcome that we want.
I actually was going to talk about how boards, committees, and commissions are more effective and efficient when they are diverse. So good job. And how I felt our community just wasn't there. And I'll just add one word: we just got too comfortable. And I know neither of those stories very well. So I'm just going to stop there because I'll start making stuff up, and that's not good.
Well, I want to see if we have 2 functional microphones, because we need one for the panelists, one is attached to my face, and we need another one for audience members to be able to ask their questions. I also want to call on one of my conference team members to circulate the microphone among audience members, and I think this one's functional here. Okay. Please raise your hand if you have a question for the panel.
Start this way and work down. So.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to answer a, well, I hope I find the right words, but I'd like to examine the key word in, I think, the title of this presentation and tie it into, I think, a possible solution, or at least a critical issue that is, I think, part of the future here. And that is to define mid-sized, not so much in terms of population or land area, but as into a different parameter. And that is, and the way I'm going to do this is to compare cities that are bigger than mid-sized cities. And take, for example, like Boston, which had independent centers of development in different eras. And so what were fishing villages? Well, the financial district and the manufacturing areas developed at different eras at different times that then contributed to the distinctive character of those districts. Whereas in Rochester, we really have only like one district where everyone gathers, and that's the central business district here, the downtown. And then the industrial centers that developed were really one company centers. And so when you take a look at what happens when those industries pass, they were not able to catch the wave to the next generation of whatever, then those areas kind of collapsed. Whereas in larger cities that do have these distinctive districts, when one of those districts, like textiles, disappears in New York, well, then there's other industries to take over that. And so the city doesn't really ever fade into like Detroit. And the reason why I think this matters is because we're right now at a crux, and that has to do with the AI revolution. And so if you look at what's likely going to happen if we don't address this problem, is that the jobs will be startup companies, probably not in Rochester, but the few that are will probably be in the suburbs. And over time, I think we're going to lose that edge because the people who are unskilled or semi-skilled won't be able, if all they have to contribute is their own labor without their ability to augment what they do with AI, they will fall further behind. They'll have less income to pay the rent to support the housing stock. And as the housing stock gets older and older, we're going to reach a crisis level of housing. And so the reason why this matters is that there is a germane issue, I think, that is before City Council, not yet, but I don't think the feedback so far has been encouraging, and that has to do with the Downtown Business Improvement District. So if you look at Rochester, the focus on downtown really is something that started almost 100 years ago, even more than 100 years ago. And if you have to get a job in the suburbs and then go and try to pick up your kids somewhere away from home and try to do that on the bus system, it's nearly impossible to do without spending an hour getting into downtown or half an hour getting out. And then to be able to chain these trips together is nearly impossible to do without a car. And so,
Sir, in the interest of getting to more questions.
yeah, so the reason why I
Please
think this
wrap
is
up.
going to be a problem, I'll make it brief, is that based upon what I heard from the audience reaction when Mayor Evans yesterday talked about the Downtown Improvement District and the tepid reaction from the audience, I don't think it'll pass. And I think that will just sink downtown and the rest of the city because the wealth is in the suburbs. And I haven't heard anyone here or even in the general discussion talking about how to, not at the county level, but at the civic level, to draw in people with the wealth to actually reinvest in downtown or the city.
John, so far the bid has come to council one time and it passed 6-3. There's probably 4 more votes that are going to have to come our way, but the best way for it to pass or not pass is for citizens like you to get involved with them. That's being planned by RDDC. They need to hear people like you. So go to their meetings, but so far it's gone to council 1 out of 5 times and it's passed. And I ultimately, I don't have any comments on the bid itself because there's no plan in front of us. But at the end of the day, the idea of trying to activate downtown is something that we just have to do as a city. And no matter how much philanthropy comes in, no matter how much Constellation Brands or private business comes in, there needs to be an organizing body somehow, some way. So hopefully there'll be a good plan presented to us, but I'd encourage you to get involved.
And I just want to say it's something that we have to do as a county. It's something that we often don't talk about in the bigger picture of things. And actually, one of the main reasons why I enjoy being a member of the county legislature is because oftentimes when we talk about the issues of the city of Rochester, we only focus on the mayor, we only focus on city council, only focus on the smaller budget, but county legislature has a vital role in ensuring that we're focusing on, and should, as members of our community, focus on the health and prosperity of downtown, because it will impact the health and prosperity of our suburbs. So that was a passion moment for me. Like, no, we always only focus on one governing body, but there's another governing body that has a lot more money and influence. Just saying. Money for sure.
In the interest of getting to as many questions as possible, because we have to end at 5, please keep your questions brief.
I'll keep it very brief, and a comment that could lead to more comments, probably. When I don't think about gender and domestic science at RIT in the deep history, I think a lot about computers and gender and diversity. And I was struck by a disjunct that I heard in the panel comments, where on the one hand we agreed that diversity and bringing many people together into the same room is incredibly important in helping Rochester move forward. And then on the other hand, the examples of companies that were mentioned as possible anchors, many of them had tech connections, and having studied the tech industry, it doesn't have the best record when it comes to gender and diversity. I do think we need to think through that more carefully.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we want to maybe knit a couple of questions together and then try to answer them.
Sure. Yeah.
Do it that way.
When I moved here in 2008, I actually bought a house. Well, I bought two houses actually, and what I was told right away is that a lot of the housing around here, like in not just downtown but just all over the city, is owned by people out of the area and sometimes out of the country. And so if you're going to look at the problems that are faced by like the working poor in the city and in the county. That's one of the things that we're looking at is that their living conditions aren't, they're not up to par, and the buildings are not owned by people who live here locally. I also wanted to mention that the year that I moved here, RG&E was bought by I think some place in some other country. Right. So I noticed that there's nobody from the Eastern Service Workers Association on your panel. It's true that there is a sleeping giant, and money may have nothing whatsoever to do with it. At Eastern Service Workers Association, we get people who are in need who come and we advocate for each other. I mean, I have personal experience like writing letters and, getting, and I love our governor right now. Kathy Hochul is just amazing. She's very responsive. If you have like a major problem, write to her because she's brilliant. Okay. And I just like to say
want to
that.
try to squeeze in one more question?
Can I just finish my sentence and then we're done? Thank you. Got it. Right. But the point is that because of the efforts of people working with the Eastern Service Workers Association, like the working poor, we are now on the brink of locally owning our utility company. And I think that's results. And that's something that I'd like to see in future panels, talking about change that's brought about not by people with deep pockets, but by the working poor doing it for ourselves.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Mark. My opinion on this is if Rochester ever wants to be a leader again, when we had Kodak and we had all the other companies like R.F. Harris, and we had, there were several companies that were leaders in technology like Xerox. We need to solicit new talent that is capable of creating new ideas and technology. You can't just have a dynamic person out there, a personality, enticing the public with what? A dynamic personality? You've got to have something to offer. And if Rochester wants to be a leader, you've got to offer new technology that will give the country another direction. Otherwise, you're just sitting here spinning your wheels, wondering how are we going to take care of day-to-day finances and whatever.
So I think we've knitted.
So you need to solicit new talent.
So I think we've knitted as many together as we can at this juncture. I'll take a crack and then certainly. So I was really intrigued with the question about technology and the lack of diversity in that arena and how critical it is for, and many of us have read some of the stories about algorithms, facial recognition software, and some of the flaws in that technology. To me, that is the opportunity for a place like Rochester, right? We can be a place that leads the country in diverse technological talent development. That's something we could do here if we've got the collective will and if we build our narrative around it. And there are a number of interesting industries. I was with Jim Sinal earlier today, who is over at NextCore. And I've said to Jim and to others, one of the opportunities for us is that when we walk through NextCore, I don't want the population of people of color to go up by 100% because I walked in the door, right? We want to start to think a lot more about a more distributed approach to innovation, because having more innovation is largely about, to the point in the back, innovation is not just new technologies and new ideas. Where do new ideas come from, right? They come from different perspectives. And that, to me, is what's really important for us to leverage, our different perspectives. The other thing I would say about innovation is that we tend to think of it in terms of technology, like hard technology, your phone, the computers and stuff. But technology is just about doing things differently. I would actually argue that the innovation that Rochester needs, that equity is the innovation for Rochester. It's the thing that we haven't done, the thing we haven't tried. And that's not just a like a cool catchphrase. Equity fundamentally means who gets to lay claim and who gets to decide. We've had attempts at it, neighbors building neighborhoods, but there are more opportunities for us to build more will and to have a little bit more stick to itness to those ideas so we get them a chance to mature.
Are there other panelists that would like to respond? And we are constrained for time. So please respond, but briefly.
Obviously, there are a number of things that were said, but I think one of the things that I wanted to respond to was some of the discussion around housing, if you will. And, it's going to take the pulling of several levers here, right? There is no one solution that's going to make things immaculately wonderful all of a sudden. But in regards to housing, I still truly believe that we have a very untapped, potential, if you will, in one of the greatest tools that we have here in the city of Rochester and the county is our land bank. It is, I'm not sure if many of you are familiar, but several years ago, the state approved the opportunity for, at the start, 10 land banks throughout the state that truly allowed the opportunity for municipalities to really take control of some of the properties within their jurisdictions. Rather, when those properties are tax delinquent, we all know they go to a foreclosure auction, and it's basically, the rules say, it has to be sold to the highest bidder. The land bank has the opportunity, certain privileges bestowed upon it, the ability to actually acquire certain properties, and then the rules change, if you will. The municipality then has the opportunity to decide whether demolition makes sense, rehabilitation makes sense, where and who do those properties potentially go to. There's a lot more, again, of that collective say of what needs to happen with that housing stock, with commercial buildings, what have you. And that's the type of empowerment and authority that I believe that municipalities need to have, rather than allowing the market, if you will, dictate the highest bidder in terms of what we own and need, again, for the prosperity of our residents. So I do think that is an underutilized tool that we have here in our city.
Anyone else? In that case, I'd like you to please join with me with a hearty round of applause for these wonderful panelists.